Jasmine stands at the towering iron gates, a basket of oranges trembling in her small hands. She has knocked on dozens of doors today, most slammed in her face. The intercom crackles. A voice asks what she wants. She mentions the oranges. The gates swing open. She steps inside, not knowing this single moment will unravel everything she believed about her life. Not knowing that behind those doors waits a photograph. Her mother's face, younger, smiling, hanging on a billionaire's wall. The truth is about to destroy her. The morning started, like every other morning, in the cramped one-bedroom apartment on the west side of Charlotte, North Carolina, where the paint peeled from walls like dead skin, and the February cold crept through cracks in the windows because the heater had been broken for 3 weeks, and the landlord refused to fix it. Jasmine woke to the sound that had become the soundtrack of her life, her mother's coughing, wet and desperate, coming from the other room where Diane slept on a mattress on the floor because they had sold the bed frame 2 months ago to pay for groceries. Jasmine pulled on the same jeans she had worn for 4 days straight and padded barefoot across the cold linoleum to the bathroom where she found her mother collapsed on the floor, too weak to stand, her brown skin ashen and her lips cracked and bleeding. Jasmine was 9 years old, and she had learned to be strong, to swallow her fear, to do what needed to be done, so she helped her mother up, feeling how light Diane had become, nothing but bones and determination, and guided her back to the mattress where Diane lay gasping and apologizing in a whisper. Stage 3, kidney disease. That's what the doctor at the free clinic had said 6 months ago, when Diane finally admitted something was wrong, when the exhaustion and nausea and swelling became impossible to hide, and the doctor had spoken in that flat tone that medical professionals use when they deliver bad news to poor people who have no insurance and no options. Diane had worked 2 jobs, her whole adult life, first at the grocery store and then cleaning office buildings at night, but when her body started failing she had to quit both because she could barely stand for an hour without needing to sit down, and now they were 3 months behind on rent and Mr. Peterson, their landlord, a white man in his 50s with a permanent scowl and a way of looking at them like they were trash he had to tolerate, had taped an eviction notice to their door last week that gave them until the end of the month to pay $800 or be thrown out onto the street. Jasmine attended Lincoln Elementary School in their neighborhood, a school where most of the kids looked like her, where the teachers were overworked and underpaid, where the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the textbooks were 10 years old. But she had missed 2 weeks of school because someone had to take care of her mother, and there was no one else, no family, no support system, just the 2 of them, against the world like it had always been. A neighbor, Mrs. Thompson, had called social services last week after seeing Jasmine carrying her mother to the bathroom, and now there was a case file somewhere with their names on it, a file that could result in Jasmine being taken away, placed in foster care, separated from the only person she had ever loved, and that fear lived in Diane's eyes every moment of every day. Jasmine's father was a ghost, a shadow, a man her mother never spoke about except to say he was gone before Jasmine was born, that it was complicated, that some questions were better left unasked, and Jasmine had learned not to push, because every time she did, her mother's face would crumble in a way that made Jasmine feel guilty for being curious about her own existence. The night before, Jasmine had been unable to sleep, listening to her mother cry in the next room, hearing Diane talking to herself the way she did when she thought Jasmine couldn't hear, saying things like, "We're going to lose everything, and I don't know what to do, and I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." And Jasmine had pressed her hands over her ears and tried to think of solutions the way her teacher, Mrs. Davis, always said to do: break down the problem into manageable pieces. And the problem was simple. They needed $800, and they needed it fast. In the morning, after helping her mother, Jasmine had found a crumpled flyer on the street advertising day labor, $15 an hour for yard work. But when she called the number, a man had laughed and said, "Come back when you're 16, kid." And Jasmine had felt that familiar burn of helplessness until she remembered seeing her friend Marcus's older brother selling candy bars door to door last summer, making enough money to buy new sneakers. She had taken the last $20 bill from her mother's purse, the money Diane had been saving for medicine, and Jasmine knew it was stealing, but she also knew desperate times required desperate measures. Another thing Mrs. Davis liked to say, and she had walked 4 blocks to the small Latino grocery store where Mr. Davis, Garcia, a kind man with sad eyes who always gave day-old bread to the neighborhood kids, had looked surprised when Jasmine asked to buy as many oranges as $20 could get. Mr. Garcia had studied her for a long moment, this tiny black girl with cornrows coming loose and shoes with holes in the soles, and he had filled a basket with oranges, at least 30 of them, bright and perfect, and when Jasmine tried to pay, he had waved her money away and given her the basket too, telling her in his accented English that she was a good daughter and her mother was lucky to have her. Jasmine had thanked him and left quickly before the tears could come, because crying was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she had started in her own neighborhood, knocking on doors in the government housing complex, where most families were barely surviving themselves, and people had been kind but broke, shaking their heads, saying they wished they could help, and after 2 hours, Jasmine had sold exactly 3 oranges for $2 each to Mrs. Johnson, old and arthritic, and probably hungry herself but generous anyway. She needed a new strategy, needed to go where people had money to spare, so she had taken the bus using her school bus pass. That was technically only for getting to and from school, but the driver had let her on without questions, and she had ridden across Charlotte to where the houses got bigger, and the lawns got greener, and the cars in the driveways cost more than her mother would make in 5 years. The contrast was shocking, almost obscene. These massive homes, with their perfect landscaping, and their security systems, and their sense of permanence, as if poverty and struggle existed in a different universe entirely. And Jasmine felt small and out of place, and very aware of how she must look to the people who lived here, this poor black child with her basket of oranges like something out of a history book. The first house she tried, a white woman with blonde hair and yoga clothes had opened the door, looked Jasmine up and down with an expression that wasn't quite disgust, but close to it, and said, "We don't want any," before Jasmine could even speak, closing the door with enough force that the wreath hanging on it shook. The second house, a white man in his 30s, had stepped onto his porch, told Jasmine to get off his property, threatened to call the police if she didn't leave immediately, and Jasmine had backed away with her heart pounding because she knew what happened to black kids who encountered police, had heard the stories, had been given the talk by her mother about keeping her hands visible and speaking respectfully and never making sudden movements. The third house, a white teenage girl had answered, taken one look at Jasmine, and laughed, actually laughed, asking, "Shouldn't you be in school?" in a mocking tone that made Jasmine's cheeks burn with shame. And the fourth house, an elderly white woman had called her sweetie and said she didn't carry cash and seemed uncomfortable in a way that Jasmine couldn't quite define, a discomfort that seemed less about the oranges and more about Jasmine herself. She kept walking, kept trying, feeling the weight of how people looked at her, or more accurately, how they looked through her, seeing not a desperate child trying to save her mother but a nuisance, a problem, a representative of everything they had built their walls and their gates to keep out. By the time Jasmine reached Myers Park, the wealthiest neighborhood in Charlotte, her feet hurt in her 2 small shoes, and her arms ached from carrying the basket, and she had sold only 3 oranges and made $6, and she wanted to cry, but she couldn't, because crying wouldn't save her mother, wouldn't pay the rent, wouldn't fix anything. So she pushed forward into streets lined with mansions that looked like museums, homes with circular driveways and fountains and gardens maintained by invisible workers, and everything felt surreal, like she had walked into a movie about rich people, and she was the only real thing in it. A security guard in a golf cart, white and stern with mirrored sunglasses and a radio on his belt, stopped her within minutes, asking what she was doing here, in a tone that made it clear he already knew the answer and didn't approve, and Jasmine explained about the oranges and her mother and the sickness and the desperation, and the guard had looked at her with something that might have been pity, but was more likely annoyance, and he told her soliciting wasn't allowed in this neighborhood, that she needed to leave. But when Jasmine begged, when she said, "Please, just let me try a few houses, my mama is dying," Something in his expression shifted and he sighed and said 10 minutes. Then you're gone. And Jasmine had nodded and walked quickly before he could change his mind. At the end of the street stood the largest house Jasmine had ever seen, more castle than home, with stone walls and iron gates and a fountain visible through the entrance. And Jasmine felt a strange pull toward it, a sense that this was her last chance, that if she failed here she might as well give up. And she approached the intercom box mounted on the stone pillar next to the gates, pressed the button with a shaking finger, and waited. A male voice came through the speaker, calm and measured, asking who was there and what did she want. And Jasmine spoke into the intercom, explaining about the oranges, and there was a long pause during which Jasmine held her breath. And then the voice said, "Hold on." And then the gates began to open, with a low, mechanical hum that sounded like the future welcoming her into its embrace. Jasmine walked up the long, curved driveway, her shoes crunching on perfect gravel, passing manicured hedges and flower beds that must have cost more to maintain than her mother made in a year, and through the massive windows of the house she could see movement, a figure in dark clothes. And as she got closer, she could make out details. A tall white man, maybe in his 40s, with salt and pepper hair and an expensive-looking sweater, and he was watching her approach, his face visible now. And there was something in his expression that Jasmine couldn't read. Not anger and not kindness, but something else. Something that made her stomach twist with an emotion she couldn't name. And she realized, with a chill that slid down her spine like ice water, that he was looking at her, not the way the other people had looked at her, with dismissal or pity or annoyance, but with recognition, as if he had been waiting for her, as if he knew exactly who she was. The front door opened before Jasmine could knock, swinging inward on silent hinges to reveal the man she had seen through the window. And up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered with ice-blue eyes, and a face that was handsome in the way that successful white men often were, all sharp angles and confidence, and the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of good breeding and better nutrition. He looked down at Jasmine with an expression that was difficult to read, something between curiosity and concern, and something darker that Jasmine couldn't identify, and he asked her name in a voice that was smooth and controlled. And when Jasmine answered, giving her full name Jasmine Marie Brooks, she watched something flicker across his face, a micro-expression that came and went so fast she might have imagined it. He asked her age, and she said 9. And he asked where she lived, and she said, West Charlotte. And his questions became strangely specific, asking what her mother's name was, and where she worked, and how long they had lived in Charlotte. And Jasmine answered, because she had been taught to be respectful to adults, especially white adults, especially rich white adults, and she said her mother's name was Diane Brooks, and she used to work at grocery stores and cleaning jobs, but she was too sick now, and they had lived in Charlotte Jasmine's whole life, except for the first few years when they lived somewhere else that her mother never talked about. When Jasmine said Diane Brooks, the man's entire posture changed, his shoulders stiffening and his jaw clenching and his eyes widening just slightly, and he stood there for a moment saying nothing, just staring at Jasmine as if seeing her for the first time, and then he seemed to collect himself and introduced himself as Richard Hartwell. And the name meant nothing to Jasmine, but the way he said it suggested it should mean something, suggested he was used to recognition and deference. Richard said he would buy all her oranges, but she should come inside while he got his wallet. And Jasmine hesitated because her mother had taught her about stranger danger, about not going into houses with people she didn't know, but desperation overrode caution. And besides, this was clearly a rich man, and rich men didn't need to hurt poor children, they had too much to lose. So she stepped across the threshold into a foyer that was larger than her entire apartment, with marble floors that reflected the light from a crystal chandelier hanging 2 stories above, and a sweeping staircase that curved up to the second floor like something from a movie. Richard gestured for her to wait in a room off to the side, what he called the sitting room, and Jasmine walked in and felt like she had entered another world. A room filled with furniture that looked antique and expensive, paintings on the walls in heavy gold frames, a fireplace with an ornate mantel, and everything was so clean and perfect and untouched that Jasmine was afraid to move, afraid her presence alone might soil something. Richard disappeared down a hallway, his footsteps echoing on the marble, and Jasmine stood in the center of the sitting room, turning slowly to take it all in. This display of wealth so extreme it felt almost violent, and she thought about her mother lying on a mattress on the floor, and the broken heater, and the eviction notice, and the cruelty of a world where this much luxury could exist in the same city as that much suffering. She walked slowly around the room, drawn to the paintings, wanting to see what rich people considered art worth hanging on their walls, and most of the paintings were landscapes or abstract shapes that meant nothing to her. But then above the fireplace she saw something that made her stop breathing, made her heart stop beating, made the entire world contract to a single point of impossible recognition. It was a photograph, large and professionally framed, and in the photograph was her mother. But a version of her mother Jasmine had never seen, young and healthy and smiling, with a joy that seemed to radiate from the image, wearing a beautiful white dress that looked expensive, her hair styled and her makeup perfect and her skin glowing. And she looked happy in a way that Jasmine didn't know was possible. Happy in a way that spoke of hope and love and a future full of promise. Jasmine stepped closer, her basket of oranges forgotten at her feet, and she studied every detail of the photograph, taking in her mother's younger face, the way she was looking at something off camera, with an expression of such tenderness, it made Jasmine's chest ache. And written in small script in the corner of the frame was a date from 10 years ago, before Jasmine was born, and she realized she was looking at her mother in the before times, before sickness, before poverty, before whatever had broken her into the exhausted woman coughing herself to death in a West Charlotte apartment. The questions exploded in Jasmine's mind, tumbling over each other in a chaotic rush. Why did this rich white man have her mother's picture? How did they know each other? What was their connection? And the obvious answers seemed impossible but also inevitable, and Jasmine felt dizzy with the implications, felt like the floor was tilting beneath her feet. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Richard standing in the doorway, holding a wallet in one hand and a large envelope in the other. And when he saw what she was looking at, when he saw her standing in front of the photograph staring at her mother's image, his face went pale, actually lost color right in front of her eyes, and his hands started to shake. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, and Jasmine could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. And finally she found her voice, and asked in a whisper that sounded too loud in the perfect room, "Do you recognize her?" And Richard didn't answer immediately, just stood there looking at the photograph with an expression of such pain and regret that it was almost hard to look at. And then he said yes, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Yes, I recognize her." Jasmine asked how did he know her mother? And Richard walked slowly into the room, moving like a man much older than he was, and he sat down heavily on the expensive sofa as if his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. And he asked Jasmine to tell him her full name again, her birthday, anything she knew about her father, and Jasmine repeated her name, said she was born March 15th 9 years ago, said her father left before she was born, and her mother never talked about him, except to say it was complicated, and he was gone. Richard did the math in his head. Jasmine could see him calculating dates and timelines, and his hands were shaking harder now, and he looked at Jasmine with new eyes, studying her face feature by feature as if searching for something. And he said something that made no sense, said, "You have her eyes but your nose, your chin, that's not from Diane." Jasmine felt anger rising in her chest, pushing aside the fear and confusion, and she demanded to know why he had her mother's picture in his house, what their relationship had been. And Richard stood up and started pacing, clearly struggling with what to say, how much to reveal, and he asked questions. Instead of answering them, asked if Diane was married, if Jasmine had ever met her father, if they were in contact with him, and Jasmine said no to everything. Said it had always been just her and her mama. Said her mama worked herself to exhaustion trying to provide for her. Said they were poor and struggling, and her mama was dying and they had nothing. Richard stopped pacing and looked at Jasmine directly, and he said something that made the room spin. Said, "Your mother and I knew each other a long time ago." And Jasmine asked when and how and why, the questions spilling out, and Richard's tone became defensive and evasive, He said it was complicated, said Diane worked for his family when they were younger, said they were involved for a brief time, said it was a mistake. The word mistake hit Jasmine like a physical blow, and she saw Richard realize what he had said, saw him try to backtrack, but it was too late. The word hung in the air between them, like poison. And Jasmine was putting the pieces together. The timeline, the photograph, Richard's age, his questions about her birthday. And she asked the question that had been building since the moment she saw her mother's picture. Asked it in a voice that trembled with emotion. "Are you my father?" Richard didn't answer right away. And in that pause, Jasmine saw the answer written on his face, saw the guilt and the fear and the resignation. But instead of confirming what they both knew, instead of acknowledging the truth, Richard pulled out his phone with shaking hands and pulled up a photograph, a family portrait showing him with a white woman who looked polished and perfect, and two white children who looked maybe 11 and 13, all of them smiling in their expensive clothes in front of what looked like a country club. And Richard said in a voice that had gone cold and flat, "I have a family, a real family. This conversation needs to end." The casual cruelty of his words, the emphasis on real family as if Jasmine and her mother were fake, were less than, were not deserving of acknowledgement, made something break inside Jasmine's chest. And she understood in that moment that this wasn't going to be a happy reunion, that Richard wasn't going to sweep them up and save them and make everything okay, that whatever had happened between him and her mother all those years ago, he was ashamed of it, ashamed of them, and he wanted them to disappear. But Jasmine didn't leave, didn't turn and run despite the dismissal in Richard's voice, and the clear message that she wasn't welcome, because anger was flooding through her system now, hot and righteous, and burning away the fear. And she stood her ground in the middle of this mansion with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and she demanded to know why he kept her mother's photograph if she meant so little to him, why he displayed it above his fireplace, in a room he clearly used. And Richard's careful composure cracked just slightly, a fissure appearing in his controlled facade, and he admitted through clenched teeth that Diane had been special, different from other people he had known, but his family would never have accepted her. A black woman from the wrong side of Charlotte, someone without money or connections or the right last name. And he had a reputation to protect back then, a business to inherit, expectations to meet. And when Diane got pregnant, his parents had paid her to disappear. The revelation hit Jasmine like cold water. Her mother had taken money to leave. Her mother had been paid off. And she felt confused and betrayed until Richard continued talking, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. And he explained, it wasn't that simple. Said Diane hadn't taken the money initially. Said she had wanted to keep the baby. Wanted Richard to be involved. Wanted them to figure it out together. But Richard's father, Charles Hartwell, had intervened because Richard himself was too weak to handle the situation, too afraid of disappointing his family, too cowardly to stand up for what he claimed to feel. Charles Hartwell, Richard explained, was old money and old power. A man with political connections and social influence, and the kind of casual cruelty that came from generations of never being told no. And when Diane came to the Hartwell estate asking for help, asking for Richard to acknowledge his responsibility, Charles had taken her to his private office and made her an offer she couldn't refuse. Except, it wasn't really an offer. It was a threat wrapped in money. Charles told Diane that if she didn't take the $50,000 and leave Charlotte and never contact Richard again, he would destroy her life systematically and thoroughly, would ensure she was fired from every job she tried to get, would spread rumors about her character and her morals, would use his connections to make sure she became unemployable and unhireable, would paint her as a woman trying to trap a rich man, would drag her name through the mud until she had nothing left. And more than that, Charles had threatened to take the baby away, had said he would use his money and his lawyers and his connections to prove Diane was an unfit mother, would claim she was unstable or incompetent or dangerous, would have the child placed in foster care or given to a family the Hartwells approved of, and Diane would lose her baby either way. But at least if she took the money, she could raise her child in peace somewhere far away. Diane had been 19 years old, alone, terrified, with no family to support her and no resources to fight back. And she had looked at Charles Hartwell's cold eyes and his cruel smile, and she knew he would do exactly what he promised. Knew that powerful white men in the South had been destroying black women's lives with impunity for centuries, and nothing had really changed. So she took the money, and she left. Moved to Columbia, South Carolina, had her baby there, stayed away from Charlotte until Jasmine was 4 years old, and Diane hoped enough time had passed that the Hartwells had forgotten about them. Richard had never tried to find them, never sent support beyond that initial $50,000 which Diane had used to survive those first desperate years as a single mother, never reached out to ask if the child was okay, or if Diane needed help, just moved on with his life, as if they had never existed, married a woman named Catherine from another wealthy family, a strategic match that merged 2 business empires, and had his legitimate children, and built his respectable life on a foundation of abandoned responsibility. Jasmine asked again about the photograph. Why keep it? And Richard's face softened for the first time, showing something that might have been genuine emotion beneath the layers of self-protection, and he admitted he had loved Diane, truly loved her, but he had been a coward, had chosen money and status and family approval over love, and he regretted it every day but not enough to do anything about it. He married Catherine within a year of Diane's departure, he said, a marriage arranged by their families, a merger of companies more than a union of people, and it was loveless but maintained appearances, gave him the respectable life his father demanded, and he kept Diane's photograph in his private study, this room where Catherine never came, as a reminder of what he had sacrificed, what he had lost, what he had been too afraid to fight for. Jasmine felt sick listening to this, felt sick hearing her existence reduced to a sacrifice, to a regret, to a reminder of roads not taken, and she wanted to scream at this man that she was a person, that her mother was a person who had suffered and struggled and nearly died trying to give her daughter a decent life, that they weren't philosophical concepts or memory objects, but real people with real pain. But Richard wasn't finished. His tone was shifting again from nostalgic to businesslike, the vulnerable moment passing as quickly as it had come, and he said he wanted to help, but there were conditions, said it in the same voice he probably used in business meetings, calm and measured and completely devoid of warmth. He would give Jasmine money for her mother's medical bills and rent, he said, enough to solve their immediate problems, but Diane could never know that Jasmine had come here, could never know they had met, could never know Richard was involved. The money would come through a lawyer anonymously, and in exchange Jasmine and Diane would have to sign legal documents, a non-disclosure agreement that would prevent them from ever publicly claiming Richard as Jasmine's father, ever seeking additional money beyond what he offered, ever contacting him or his family directly, and if they violated these terms they would get nothing, and he would sue them for defamation and slander and anything else his lawyers could think of. Richard framed it as protection, as necessary caution, saying his family couldn't know, his business associates couldn't know. Think of what this would do to his children, to his reputation, to his standing in the community, and Jasmine realized she wasn't a daughter to him. She was a liability, a threat, a problem, to be managed with lawyers and contracts and money. She asked how much, the words bitter in her mouth, and Richard named a figure that made her head spin. $100,000 paid immediately, plus monthly payments of $2,000, until Jasmine turned 18, in exchange for their silence and their absence and their agreement to stay out of his life. Jasmine's mind was reeling, trying to process the amount of money, an amount that would change everything for her and her mother, would pay for treatment and rent and food and clothes, and maybe even let them breathe for the first time in Jasmine's memory. But the price wasn't just measured in what they would get. It was measured in what they would give up, their right to the truth, their right to acknowledgement, their right to claim their place in Richard's family tree. She thought about her mother dying without treatment, thought about the eviction notice, thought about living on the streets, thought about her mother's pride and how hard she had worked to give Jasmine a life, and she wondered if her mother would accept this blood money, if she would sign away their truth for survival. And Jasmine didn't know the answer because she had never seen her mother faced with a choice like this, had never seen what Diane would do when pushed to the absolute edge. She was about to speak, about to ask for time to think, when Richard added one more condition that made Jasmine's blood turn to ice. his voice dropping lower and harder. And he said, "And you'll need to convince your mother to sign. If she refuses, if she makes this difficult, the offer disappears completely, and I will make sure you both regret it. I have friends in social services, in the police department, in the court system. I can make your lives very hard, harder than they already are." The threat wasn't veiled or subtle. It was explicit and clear. He wasn't offering help. He was offering extortion disguised as charity, using their desperation as leverage to force them into silence. And Jasmine understood that Richard Hartwell wasn't the father she had never known. He was just another powerful white man who saw black women and their children as problems to be solved or threats to be eliminated, and he was counting on their poverty and their fear to make them compliant. Jasmine left the mansion feeling like she was moving through water, everything slow and muffled and surreal, and clutched in her hand was the envelope Richard had given her, heavy with cash and heavier with implications, $5,000 in $100 bills as what Richard called a gesture of good faith, along with a business card for his attorney, who would handle the formal arrangements if Diane agreed to his terms. The bus ride home was a blur, Jasmine staring out the window watching Charlotte pass by, the wealthy neighborhoods giving way to middle-class areas and then to the struggling parts of town where she belonged. And she looked at the other passengers, tired people heading home from work or from looking for work, and she wondered if they were carrying secrets this big, if their lives felt this complicated and impossible. When she got off at her stop, Mrs. Johnson was standing outside the building, the elderly black woman who lived on the first floor and seemed to know everything that happened in the complex, and she stopped Jasmine with a gnarled hand on her shoulder and asked if she had sold all those oranges, her voice kind but worried. And Jasmine lied automatically, said, "Yes, ma'am, made good money today," and Mrs. Johnson's eyes narrowed like she didn't quite believe it, but she nodded and said, "Be careful out there, baby. Those rich neighborhoods aren't safe for little black girls. They don't see us as people, just problems to solve or threats to remove," and the words hit harder than Mrs. Johnson could have known, hitting right at the center of what Jasmine had just experienced. She climbed the stairs to their apartment on the 3rd floor, each step feeling heavier than the last, and she opened the door to find her mother unconscious on the bathroom floor, and panic exploded in Jasmine's chest, making it hard to breathe. And she dropped to her knees beside Diane, shaking her and calling her name, and "Please, Mama, please wake up." And she grabbed the phone and called 911 with trembling fingers, and the operator asked questions Jasmine could barely answer because her brain was screaming and her vision was blurring with tears. The paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, 2 men, 1 white and 1 black, and they moved with efficient calm that Jasmine found both comforting and terrifying, checking Diane's vitals and asking Jasmine questions about her mother's medical history. And the black paramedic whose name tag said Marcus looked at Jasmine with something like recognition, like he had seen this exact scenario play out too many times, a sick mother and a scared child, and poverty turning medical problems into emergencies. They got Diane conscious, but barely, her eyes unfocused and her words slurred, and they said she was severely dehydrated, and her kidney function was declining rapidly, and she needed to go to the hospital immediately. But Diane, in her half-conscious state, was shaking her head, saying, "No, can't afford it, let me die at home." And Marcus knelt down next to her and said, "Ma'am, without treatment you're going to die, maybe weeks, maybe days. This isn't something you can ignore anymore." And Diane started crying, big silent tears rolling down her hollow cheeks, and Jasmine started crying too. And finally Diane agreed to go, because what choice did she have when her daughter was watching her give up? The emergency room at Carolina Medical Center was crowded and overwhelming, bright fluorescent lights, and the smell of disinfectant and suffering, and Diane was taken back immediately because of how critical her condition was. But Jasmine had to wait in the waiting room for 3 hours, surrounded by other people in various states of medical crisis, and she noticed a pattern. The white families seemed to get called back faster, seemed to be treated with more respect and attention by the staff, seemed to navigate the system with ease that came from expecting institutions to work for them rather than against them. When a nurse finally called Jasmine back, she found her mother in a small, curtained area hooked up to IV fluids, looking even smaller and more fragile in the hospital bed, and a doctor came in shortly after, a white man in his 50s with gray hair and an efficient manner, and he explained in clinical terms that Diane's kidneys were failing, that she needed dialysis, and eventually a transplant if she wanted to survive, that without treatment she had maybe 2 weeks left. The cost without insurance made Diane's face crumble. Dialysis was $5,000 per session, needed 3 times per week, and a transplant would be hundreds of thousands of dollars, and the doctor said it matter-of-factly, like he was discussing car repairs rather than a human life. And a hospital social worker came by, a white woman who seemed well-meaning but spoke to them with the kind of slow, careful diction people use when they think they're talking to someone less intelligent, suggesting Medicaid and charity care applications, but admitting the process took months and months Diane didn't have. After the doctor left, after the social worker left, after the nurse came to check the IV and left, Jasmine pulled out the envelope from her pocket, her hands shaking, and she showed her mother the money, the cash, and the business card. And Diane looked confused, asked where it came from, and Jasmine took a deep breath and told her everything. The mansion, the photograph, Richard Hartwell, his offer, his threats, every detail spilling out in a rush of words. Diane's face went through so many emotions, Jasmine couldn't track them all. Shock, and recognition, and pain, and anger, and fear. And she asked Jasmine to repeat Richard's name, seemed to stop breathing when Jasmine confirmed it. And finally Diane whispered, "He's here, in Charlotte." After all this time, her voice breaking on every word. She confirmed what Jasmine had suspected, that Richard was her father, but she had never told Jasmine because she wanted to protect her from rejection, from feeling unwanted, from knowing that her father had chosen money and status over being a parent, and finding out that Richard had been in Charlotte all along, that he knew where they were, that he could have helped but chose not to. Broke something in Diane that Jasmine could see cracking in real time. Diane started crying harder than Jasmine had ever seen, saying she was sorry, she tried to give Jasmine a good life, she failed as a mother, failed to protect her, failed to provide. And Jasmine held her mother's hand and cried too, and said, "You didn't fail, you did everything, you gave me everything." But Diane was shaking her head, lost in her own pain and regret. When Jasmine mentioned the money and the terms, Diane's reaction was immediate and fierce. She refused, said she wouldn't let Richard buy their silence, wouldn't let him pay them off like his father had paid her off 10 years ago. She had pride, had dignity. She would rather die than let Richard Hartwell win. And Jasmine understood that impulse, understood the need to maintain some sense of self-worth in the face of such complete rejection, but she also understood that pride was a luxury they couldn't afford. She begged her mother, said, "Mama, please, I need you. I can't lose you. I don't care about Richard or acknowledgement or anything except keeping you alive." And they argued in harsh whispers in that hospital room, both of them crying. Diane saying Jasmine deserved better than a father who was ashamed of her, and Jasmine saying she deserved a living mother, more than an absent father's acknowledgement. The fight was raw and painful, exposing wounds neither of them wanted to touch. And finally Diane's resolve began to crack, her eyes moving between the IV in her arm and her daughter's face, between her principles and her survival. And she agreed to meet with Richard's lawyer, agreed to consider the terms, but she made Jasmine promise something, looking into her daughter's eyes with an intensity that was almost frightening. And she said, "We take his money, but we don't give him our souls. We survive, we remember who we are, and someday when we're strong enough we make him answer for what he did." And Jasmine promised, not understanding yet what that promise would mean, but knowing it was important to her mother, to believe that this wasn't the end, that they weren't beaten, that survival was just the first step towards something bigger. The next morning they were preparing to leave the hospital, Diane having been stabilized enough for outpatient treatment, when there was a knock on the door of their hospital room, and a woman walked in who made all the air leave Jasmine's lungs. A white woman in her early 40s, tall and elegant and dripping with wealth, perfect blonde hair and designer clothes, and cold blue eyes. And she introduced herself as Catherine Hartwell, Richard's wife, and she said she knew everything, and she wasn't there to help. She was there to make sure Diane and Jasmine understood their place in the world order. Catherine spoke in a voice that was pleasant on the surface but vicious underneath, saying, "You will take the money and sign the papers and disappear from our lives. Because if you don't, I will destroy you both. I have connections your little minds can't comprehend. Social services will take your daughter. You'll be investigated for fraud and extortion. You'll lose everything." And she smiled when she said it. Smiled like she was discussing the weather or making small talk. And Jasmine realized that Catherine Hartwell was more dangerous than Richard because she had no guilt, no lingering feelings, no weakness that could be exploited. She was pure calculated cruelty in expensive clothes. Catherine stood in the doorway of the hospital room, looking around with barely concealed disgust, taking in the cheap hospital bed, and the medical equipment and Diane in her thin hospital gown. And everything about her posture and expression communicated that she considered this beneath her, that being in the same space as poor sick people was offensive to her sensibilities. She was polished and elegant in the way that rich white women often were, wearing clothes that probably cost more than Diane made in a year, her hair professionally styled, her makeup perfect, her jewelry understated but clearly expensive, and she looked at Jasmine and Diane like they were insects she had discovered in her house, annoying and unwanted but easily crushed. She explained in a conversational tone that Richard had confessed everything the night before after drinking too much whiskey, that he had told her about Jasmine showing up at the mansion, about the photograph, about his offer to pay them off. And Catherine wanted them to know she wasn't angry at Richard. Boys will be boys after all. But she was very angry at Diane for being what she called a seductress, for trapping Richard all those years ago, for getting pregnant on purpose to secure a payday. The racist undertones in her words were clear, even though she never said anything explicitly. Her references to your kind and people like you and knowing your place, making it obvious what she meant, and Jasmine watched her mother's face harden with rage. Catherine dropped a folder on Diane's hospital bed, letting it fall with a slap, and she told them to look inside. And when Diane opened it with shaking hands, they found copies of employment records and financial documents and medical records. And Catherine explained with obvious satisfaction that the Hartwells had been monitoring them since Diane returned to Charlotte 4 years ago, that they had private investigators keeping tabs on them, making sure Diane never made trouble or tried to contact Richard or threatened to expose their secret. She said, "We've been watching you for years. We know everywhere you've worked, everywhere you've lived, every mistake you've made. We have documentation of everything." And the violation of that, the knowledge that they had been under surveillance like criminals, made Jasmine feel sick and violated and angry. Catherine then revealed what she called the actual terms of the agreement, pulling out another set of papers from her designer handbag, and she explained that the $100,000 Richard mentioned wasn't a gift or even really a payment. It was purchasing their complete erasure from the Hartwell family narrative. The terms were far more controlling than Richard had indicated. Diane would have to agree to receive medical treatment only at facilities approved and monitored by the Hartwells. They would control her health care to ensure she wasn't traveling around telling her story to anyone, and Jasmine's schooling would be monitored too. Any attempt to enroll her in schools near where the Hartwell children attended would result in immediate legal action. The Hartwells would have full access to Diane's financial records to ensure the money wasn't being used to hire lawyers or publicists or anyone who might help them tell their story, and any violation of these terms would result in demands for full repayment, plus damages, plus legal fees. Catherine made it very clear, speaking slowly, like she was explaining something to children, that they weren't getting help. They were being bought, purchased like property, their silence and compliance for sale to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder was the Hartwell family, who could afford to pay whatever it took to protect their reputation. But Catherine wasn't finished. She had saved the worst for last, and she mentioned almost casually that she had already filed an anonymous report with Child Protective Services claiming that Jasmine was being neglected, that Diane was too sick to care for her properly, that the child was missing school and living in poverty and in danger. A social worker would be visiting within 48 hours to investigate, Catherine said. And if Diane hadn't signed the agreement by then, Catherine would provide what she called evidence of abuse and neglect, photographs taken by the private investigators, showing Jasmine selling oranges alone in wealthy neighborhoods, showing the conditions of their apartment, showing Diane collapsed and unconscious. And out of context, these photos would paint Diane as an unfit mother who was endangering her child. Catherine laid it out plainly, her voice never losing its pleasant tone. Sign the papers and I make the CPS report disappear. Refuse. And Jasmine goes into foster care while you die alone in a hospital bed. Choose wisely. Jasmine watched her mother's face crumble, watched the last of Diane's fight drain away, and she understood that this wasn't about money anymore. This was about power, about a wealthy white woman demonstrating that she could destroy their lives with a phone call and a few well-placed lies, that they had no recourse, no defense, no way to fight back. After Catherine left, sweeping out of the room like she had accomplished something important, Diane had a complete breakdown, not crying but something worse, a kind of hollow-eyed despair that scared Jasmine more than any amount of tears. Diane threw the water cup from her bedside table, knocked over the IV stand, screamed until nurses came running, and then collapsed into herself, small and defeated and hopeless in a way Jasmine had never seen. She said things that broke Jasmine's heart, said maybe you'd be better off without me. In foster care you'd have food and health care and education and a chance at a real life. I'm holding you back. I'm killing you by keeping you. And Jasmine refused to hear it, grabbing her mother's face and forcing Diane to look at her and saying, we stay together no matter what. You hear me? No matter what happens, we stay together. That night, while Diane was sleeping fitfully in the hospital bed, sedated by medication the nurses had given her, Jasmine made a decision. She was going to confront Richard herself, child to father, make him see what his cowardice was doing to them, make him understand that they were real people who mattered, and maybe if he looked in her eyes and saw his daughter, he would find some shred of decency. She sneaked out of the hospital room, walked through corridors until she found an exit, and took the bus back to Myers Park, even though it was nearly midnight. And she walked up to the Hartwell mansion and stood outside looking through the windows because the lights were on, and she could see into what looked like a living room. What she saw made her freeze in place, made her breath catch in her throat, made her question if she was seeing correctly, because through the window she could see Richard and Catherine arguing, not just arguing but fighting violently, and as Jasmine watched, Catherine slapped Richard hard across the face, and Richard grabbed her arm, and they were screaming at each other, though Jasmine couldn't hear the words. And then Catherine screamed something loud enough that Jasmine could hear it, even through the glass. And the words made Jasmine's entire world tilt and crack and break apart. Catherine was screaming, she's not even yours. I had your father run a DNA test from hair Diane left at the hotel room years ago. That child is someone else's. But we can still use this to keep Diane quiet about what your father really did to her. Jasmine stood frozen outside the mansion window, Catherine's words echoing in her head like thunder. She's not even yours. That child is someone else's. And she watched Richard's reaction through the glass, watched him stumble backward like he had been physically struck, watched his face contort with shock and confusion, and something that looked like devastation. He demanded to see the DNA results, his mouth moving in shapes Jasmine could read even if she couldn't hear him clearly, and Catherine pulled papers from somewhere, held them up, and Richard took them with shaking hands and read them, and then sat down hard on their expensive sofa, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He looked up at Catherine and said something, and Catherine laughed, actually laughed, a cruel sound that Jasmine could hear through the window, and she started talking, gesturing, pacing, clearly explaining something, and Richard looked like he might be sick. Jasmine pressed closer to the window, desperate to hear, and caught fragments of Catherine's words through the glass. Your father and took care of the problem, and you were too weak, and made her an offer she couldn't refuse, and the implications started to form in Jasmine's mind, horrible implications that she didn't want to believe. Catherine continued, her face animated with the kind of cruel pleasure some people take in delivering devastating news, and Jasmine heard her say, Diane came to beg your father for help, and Charles took her to his office, and the $50,000 wasn't from you, it was from him, payment for silence about what he did. And Richard was shaking his head saying no over and over, and Catherine nodded yes, confirming whatever horror Richard was imagining. She heard Catherine say the word assault, heard her say Charles is Jasmine's real father, heard her say your father raped the woman you claim to love and you never even knew. And Jasmine felt like the ground was opening beneath her feet, like reality itself was collapsing. Because this couldn't be true. This was too horrible to be real. Richard vomited in a trash can. Jasmine could see him leaning over and heaving, and he was crying. This grown man in his expensive house was crying, and Catherine just stood there unmoved, checking her manicured nails like she was bored. Jasmine heard Catherine explain that Charles Hartwell had died 2 years ago, that this secret had died with him, that Diane never pressed charges, never told anyone, just took the money and ran like a good victim. And Richard asked something, and Catherine answered, explaining that she was telling him now because she needed him to understand what was at stake. If Diane talked, if anyone investigated, they would uncover what Charles did. The Hartwell family name would be destroyed, their business would collapse, their social standing would evaporate. Everything they had built over generations would be gone, so, yes, they were going to pay Diane to disappear, not because Jasmine was Richard's child, but because if the truth came out, they would lose everything that mattered. Richard asked something else, and Catherine responded that Diane probably didn't know about the DNA test, probably still believed Richard was the father, and we're going to keep it that way, Catherine said, her voice hard and final. Jasmine backed away from the window, her whole body shaking uncontrollably, and she stumbled down the driveway and onto the street, and just kept walking with no destination in mind because she needed to move, needed to process what she had just learned, needed to understand what it meant that her entire understanding of her existence had just been shattered. She wasn't the product of young love gone wrong, wasn't the result of a rich boy's cowardice and a poor girl's bad luck. She was the product of violence, of assault, of a powerful white man using his position to abuse a vulnerable black woman. And her biological father wasn't Richard the coward but Charles the rapist, a man she had never met, a man who was dead and beyond punishment, a man whose blood ran in her veins and made her feel contaminated and wrong, and like she shouldn't exist at all. Jasmine found herself at a playground, empty at this late hour, and she sat on a swing in the dark and tried to process everything, tried to understand what this meant for her and her mother, tried to figure out what to do with this knowledge. Questions flooded her mind faster than she could think through them. Did her mother know the truth about whose child she really was? Had Diane been living with this trauma alone for 10 years? Is that why she never talked about Jasmine's father? And Jasmine understood now why her mother had taken the money and run. It wasn't weakness or opportunism like Catherine implied. It was survival after unspeakable violation. It was a traumatized teenager trying to protect herself and her unborn child from a man who had already proven he could and would hurt her. She also understood Catherine's viciousness now. She wasn't just protecting her husband's reputation. She was protecting a rapist's legacy, protecting the family name from the truth that Charles Hartwell had been a monster who preyed on young women and used his money and power to silence them. Jasmine sat on that swing for hours, until the sky started to lighten with dawn, and then she walked to the bus stop and rode back to the hospital, and when she entered her mother's room, Diane was awake and frantic with worry, demanding to know where Jasmine had been, and Jasmine knew she had to tell her mother what she had learned, had to share this burden because it was too heavy to carry alone. She sat Diane down and repeated everything she had overheard, every terrible word, and as she spoke she watched her mother's face carefully, looking for surprise or shock or confusion, but instead she saw something worse. She saw recognition and confirmation and resignation. Diane went completely still when Jasmine finished, her eyes vacant and unfocused, staring at something invisible in the middle distance. And then she nodded slowly and said, "You weren't supposed to know." No one was supposed to know, her voice barely above a whisper. She confirmed Jasmine's worst suspicions, explained in halting words how Charles Hartwell hadn't just assaulted her once but had manipulated her for weeks, first offering to help her connect with Richard, who was refusing her calls, then using that access as leverage, then escalating when she tried to resist. She described how Charles called her to his private office at the Hartwell estate, how he locked the door, how he told her that Richard didn't want anything to do with her, but he, Charles, could make everything okay if she was nice to him. And when Diane had said no, when she had tried to leave, he had physically prevented her, had used his size and his strength and his certainty that he would never face consequences, and he had forced himself on her while she cried and begged him to stop. Diane found out she was pregnant several weeks later, and she didn't know if the baby was Richard's from their earlier relationship or Charles's from the assault. The timeline was too close to tell, and she chose to believe the former because believing the latter would have destroyed her completely. She took the $50,000 because Charles threatened to kill her if she spoke, not metaphorically but literally. Said he would make her disappear and no one would ever find her body, and she believed him because she had seen in his eyes that he was capable of anything. The pregnancy was both her daughter and her nightmare, her hope and her trauma, her reason to survive and her reminder of violation, and she had spent 10 years trying to love Jasmine, while simultaneously trying not to think about how Jasmine came to exist, and now that secret was out. And Diane looked at her daughter with eyes full of pain and asked if Jasmine hated her for not being strong enough to fight, for running away, for accepting money from her rapist. Jasmine held her mother and cried and said she could never hate her, that Diane had survived something impossible and had built a life for them despite everything, that she was the strongest person Jasmine knew, and they cried together in that hospital room, mourning what had been stolen from them, mourning innocence and safety, and the illusion that justice was possible. Later that day, there was a knock on the hospital room door, and both of them tensed, expecting Catherine or lawyers or social services. But instead, it was Marcus, the black paramedic who had brought Diane to the hospital, except he wasn't in his uniform. He was dressed in regular clothes, and he apologized for intruding, but said he needed to speak with them about something important. He explained that he had overheard Diane's name at the hospital, and something about it had seemed familiar, so he had done some research, and his sister Angela was a lawyer who specialized in cases of assault and abuse against black women by powerful white men, and she had been trying to build a case against the Hartwell family for years. Marcus pulled out a folder and showed them documentation, testimony from 5 other women who had come forward with similar stories about Charles Hartwell, women who had worked for Hartwell companies or had been in his orbit between 15 and 30 years ago, all telling variations of the same horror story, Charles using his power to assault them, and then paying them off with NDAs and threats. Angela had been collecting this evidence, but she needed one more piece to make the case compelling enough to take public. She needed testimony from someone who could prove a pattern, someone whose story had corroboration, and Marcus thought maybe Diane was that person. He looked at Diane with understanding and respect, and said his sister has been trying to bring the Hartwell family down for years. 5 other women have come forward, but they're too scared to testify publicly. But with your testimony and Jasmine's existence as proof, we might finally be able to get justice. And then he asked the question that would change everything. Are you ready to fight? The next day, Marcus drove Diane and Jasmine to meet his sister, and the drive took them to a modest office building in a middle-class neighborhood. Nothing fancy or impressive, just a small suite on the 3rd floor with Angela Morrison's name on the door. And when they walked in, Jasmine saw a black woman in her late 30s, sharp-eyed and determined, dressed professionally but not expensively, and her office was small but organized, law books lining the walls and case files stacked on every surface. Angela greeted them warmly but seriously, understanding this wasn't a social visit, and she invited them to sit while she explained what she had been working on for the past 3 years, pulling out file after file, showing them evidence she had collected on the Hartwell family. There were 5 other women, Angela explained, all black, all former employees or associates of Hartwell companies, all with eerily similar stories about Charles Hartwell using his position and power to assault them and then buying their silence with money and threats. The women ranged in age now from their 30s to their 50s, their assaults, spanning nearly 30 years, showing a pattern of predatory behavior that Charles had engaged in throughout his adult life with complete impunity. Angela showed Diane and Jasmine photographs of the women, their statements, documentation of the payoffs, and explained that she believed with Diane's testimony and Jasmine's existence as physical proof of one of Charles's assaults, they could build a civil case against the Hartwell estate and the family members who had covered it up. She was honest about the challenges, talking in plain language about statutes of limitations and lack of physical evidence, and the reality that Charles was dead, so criminal prosecution was impossible. But she believed they could pursue a civil case for damages, not just against Charles's estate, but against Richard and Catherine Hartwell for conspiracy to cover up the crimes and for their ongoing harassment of the victims. Angela warned them that it wouldn't be easy, that the Hartwells would attack their characters, dig up every mistake they had ever made, call them liars and gold diggers and opportunists, that Diane and Jasmine would be dragged through the mud publicly, that every detail of their lives would be examined and judged and used against them. But if they won, they would expose the truth and get real compensation, not hush money, but actual justice and accountability. Diane was terrified. Jasmine could see it in every line of her body. She was sick and weak, and didn't know if she had the strength to fight people as powerful as the Hartwells, and she worried aloud about what this would do to Jasmine. Her daughter would grow up with everyone knowing she was the child of rape, that stigma could follow her forever, shape how people saw her, limit her opportunities. Angela acknowledged those concerns but pushed back gently, saying that Jasmine could also grow up knowing her mother fought for justice, knowing that what happened wasn't their shame to carry, knowing that powerful men could be held accountable even if it took years, and wasn't that a better legacy than teaching Jasmine to be silent in the face of injustice? Angela also pointed out something Diane hadn't fully considered, that the Hartwells were never going to leave them alone even if they signed the NDA. Catherine had already shown she would use them as leverage forever, would monitor and control them, would hold the threat of taking Jasmine away over their heads for years, and the only way to be truly free was to fight back, to go public, to make it so the Hartwells had more to lose by harassing them than by leaving them alone. Diane was wrestling with the decision when Catherine escalated the situation, as if she somehow knew they were considering fighting back, and that afternoon, Child Protective Services showed up at the hospital with a court order to investigate Jasmine's living conditions. 2 caseworkers came, one white woman in her 50s who seemed professionally detached, and one black woman in her 30s who seemed more sympathetic but bound by protocols, and they had official paperwork authorizing them to interview Diane and Jasmine separately and to inspect their home. Diane was forced to answer invasive questions about her income and her illness and her ability to care for her child, while Jasmine was taken to a different room and interviewed alone, asked if her mother hurt her, if she had enough food, if she felt safe, if she missed school often, if she was ever left alone. Jasmine knew this was Catherine's doing, knew this was retaliation for not signing the papers immediately, and she answered carefully and truthfully, trying to explain that her mother was good and loving, just sick and poor, that they took care of each other, that she felt safe with her mother even if they didn't have much money. The caseworkers seemed sympathetic, but explained they had to complete a full investigation. They would need to visit the apartment, review school records, interview neighbors and teachers, and they would return with a decision within 72 hours about whether Jasmine could remain in Diane's care or needed to be placed in temporary foster care for her safety. After they left, Diane collapsed, couldn't breathe, was having what the nurses called a panic attack, and Jasmine called Marcus, who immediately called Angela. And Angela arrived at the hospital within an hour, moved into action with the kind of focused energy that comes from righteous anger, and she started filing emergency motions before she even sat down. She filed motions challenging the CPS investigation as harassment and retaliation, requesting restraining orders against Catherine Hartwell, demanding discovery of who had filed the complaint and on what grounds, and then she did something that made Diane gasp. She filed the civil lawsuit. Right then, that very day, against the Hartwell estate and Richard Hartwell and Catherine Hartwell, alleging assault by Charles Hartwell, conspiracy to cover up crimes, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and seeking damages of $10 million. The lawsuit became public record immediately, and within hours local news outlets had picked it up, the story spreading across Charlotte like wildfire. Local woman sues. prominent Hartwell family, alleging decades-old assault and cover-up, and suddenly what the Hartwells had tried so hard to keep private was front-page news. Richard Hartwell showed up at Angela's office the next morning, alone, looking like he hadn't slept in days, his expensive clothes wrinkled and his eyes red, and he asked to speak to Diane privately, and Angela advised strongly against it, but Diane agreed, perhaps wanting to hear what Richard had to say now that everything was public. They sat in Angela's conference room, Jasmine and Angela waiting outside, and through the door they could hear raised voices, though not the words, and after 20 minutes, Richard emerged, looking destroyed, and Diane emerged looking both pitying and disgusted. Richard had brought evidence, a briefcase full of documents, his father's private journals where Charles had written about his conquests, including detailed accounts of assaulting Diane and others, financial records showing systematic payoffs to at least 8 women over 30 years, and recordings Richard had secretly made of conversations with Catherine, where she admitted knowing about the assaults and actively covering them up to protect the family image. Her voice on the recordings saying things like, "Those women should be grateful for the money. They're nothing without us." Richard claimed he wanted to testify against his own family, wanted to provide everything to Angela, wanted to help bring them down. But he had one request. He wanted Diane to acknowledge that he hadn't known what his father did, that he truly believed Jasmine was his daughter until a few days ago, that he wasn't the monster his father was, that he deserved some credit for trying to make amends now, even if it was late. Diane had looked at him with an expression Jasmine had never seen on her mother's face before. Pity mixed with disgust, mixed with exhaustion. And she said, "You want forgiveness, you abandoned us, you chose money over love, you let your father's evil continue. You're trying to be the hero now, but you're just another coward, trying to save yourself." And she walked out, leaving Richard sitting alone in the conference room with his evidence and his guilt. Despite Diane's rejection of his attempt at redemption, Richard turned over all his evidence to Angela, perhaps because his guilt was genuine, or perhaps because he wanted to punish Catherine for lying to him for years, or perhaps because he finally understood that being complicit in evil made him evil too, and regardless of his motivations, the evidence he provided was devastating to the Hartwell family's case. Charles Hartwell's journals were particularly damning, filled with detailed accounts of his assaults, written with the kind of chilling casualness that revealed he viewed his actions as his right, his privilege, the perks of being a powerful man, and he had written about Diane specifically, describing in graphic terms what he had done to her and how he had silenced her, viewing it all as a problem solved rather than a crime committed. The financial records Richard provided showed systematic payoffs to at least 8 different women over a 30-year span, each payment accompanied by non-disclosure agreements and legal threats. Each woman paid just enough to survive, but not enough to thrive. Each one monitored for years afterward to ensure continued silence. The recordings of Catherine were perhaps most shocking because they revealed her active role in the cover-up, not just protecting her husband's reputation, but actively participating in suppressing victims, and in one recording, she could be heard discussing strategies for intimidating Diane, including the false CPS report, laughing about how easy it was to weaponize institutions against poor people. With this evidence, Angela's case transformed from one woman's word against a powerful family to an ironclad pattern of abuse and institutional cover-up, and Angela contacted the other women who had previously been too afraid to testify, and 3 more agreed to join the lawsuit now that they had proof that they weren't alone, that their stories would be believed, that there was safety in numbers. The case evolved rapidly from Diane's individual story to a class action exposing decades of predatory behavior and systematic silencing of Black women by one of Charlotte's most prominent families. And the media coverage intensified as more details emerged. The Black community in Charlotte rallied around Diane and the other women with a speed and intensity that surprised even Angela. Community organizations holding press conferences demanding accountability, churches organizing fundraisers to support the women's legal fees, activists staging protests outside Hartwell Properties offices, carrying signs that said, "Justice for Diane and Black women deserve justice and stop protecting rapists," and the NAACP got involved. framing the case as a textbook example of how powerful white men prey on vulnerable black women with impunity, using their wealth and connections to avoid consequences while their victims suffer in silence for decades. Social media exploded with hashtags like Justice for Diane and Hartwell Accountability, thousands of people sharing the story, expressing outrage, demanding that institutions stop protecting wealthy predators, and the pressure on the Hartwell family became immense and unrelenting. But there was also backlash, conservative media outlets running stories that attacked Diane's character, questioning why she accepted the money if she had really been assaulted, implying she was opportunistic, calling the lawsuit a shakedown by a scorned woman who saw an opportunity to get rich, and commenters on these articles saying horrible things about Diane and the other women, and Richard's legitimate children were bullied at their private school. Other students, and even some parents, treating them like pariahs for their grandfather's crimes. Catherine doubled down on her denials, giving a calculated interview to a friendly news outlet where she cried on camera and called the accusations a coordinated attack by women seeking money, said her late father-in-law was a good man being slandered by people who couldn't defend themselves against the truth. And she positioned herself as a victim too, a wife, standing by her husband, who was being extorted by his youthful indiscretions. The racial dynamics of the case were impossible to ignore and became a major part of the public discussion, with white establishment figures in Charlotte largely defending the Hartwells or remaining silent, while black community leaders and allies were demanding accountability and change, and the divide revealed how differently white and black communities experienced justice and believed victims. Some white community members genuinely couldn't believe that such a respectable family could do such things, couldn't reconcile the charitable donations and the country club memberships and the social standing with the accusations of systematic sexual violence, while others privately acknowledged that powerful men had been getting away with this behavior forever, and maybe it was time for consequences. The CPS case was resolved relatively quickly. Once Angela's legal motions hit the court system, the judge assigned to the case saw through the harassment immediately. Noting that the complaint had been filed anonymously the same day, Diane had refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement with the Hartwell family, and he closed the investigation with no findings of neglect or abuse, and issued a reprimand to Child Protective Services for allowing their agency to be weaponized in a civil dispute. Jasmine was allowed to stay with Diane. The threat of separation lifted, but the victory felt small compared to everything else happening. The community support had tangible impacts beyond just moral encouragement. A GoFundMe campaign raised $80,000 in less than a week, enough to pay for Diane's dialysis treatments, while the lawsuit proceeded, and churches and community organizations provided additional support, bringing food, helping with bills, offering free childcare so Jasmine could return to school. And the outpouring showed Diane and Jasmine that they weren't alone, that their community saw them and valued them and would protect them. Diane was able to start dialysis immediately, 3 times a week, and while the treatments were exhausting and difficult, her health began to stabilize, color returning to her face, strength returning to her body, hope returning to her eyes. 2 months into the lawsuit, the Hartwell family's lawyers approached Angela with a settlement offer, clearly wanting to avoid the public spectacle of a trial where all the evidence would be presented, where the journals and the recordings and the testimonies would become part of public record forever, where their reputation would be destroyed beyond repair, and their initial offer was $5 million split among all the plaintiffs plus non-disclosure agreements, preventing any of the women from ever speaking about the case again. Angela countered immediately with $15 million. No NDAs, public apology from the Hartwell family, and the establishment of a foundation funded in perpetuity by the Hartwells to support assault survivors. And the negotiations went back and forth over weeks, the Hartwells trying to minimize the damage and the victims refusing to be silenced again. Catherine was furious. According to sources close to the family, she wanted to fight to the bitter end, wanted to drag every plaintiff through trial and destroy their credibility. But Richard had broken ranks completely now, testifying in depositions about his father's crimes and his wife's cover-up, and his testimony was devastating because he was an insider who couldn't be dismissed as a gold digger or an opportunist. His deposition was leaked to the media. Whether intentionally or not was unclear, and the public pressure became overwhelming. Hartwell Properties lost major contracts with companies that didn't want to be associated with the scandal. Banks threatened to pull financing. Investors demanded Richard and Catherine resign from the board, and the family was hemorrhaging money and reputation faster than they could contain. Finally, with their lawyers warning them that going to trial would result in even larger damages and complete destruction of the Hartwell name, they capitulated and agreed to settle. But Catherine played one final card before signing the papers, a last desperate attempt to maintain some power and control. She revealed that she had filed criminal charges against Richard for conspiracy to commit fraud, claiming that he and Diane had planned this whole thing years ago as a long con to extort money from the family, and she presented evidence that looked damning on the surface. Doctored emails supposedly between Richard and Diane discussing strategy, fake financial transfers, paid witnesses who claimed to have overheard Richard and Diane planning the scheme, and Catherine's threat was clear. If Diane didn't drop the civil suit immediately, Catherine would ensure Richard went to prison, and without Richard's testimony and evidence, the case would fall apart because it would become he said, she said again. Catherine smiled when she delivered this ultimatum, confident she had won, confident she had found the one pressure point that would force Diane to back down. And she said, "You can have money or justice, but you can't have both. Choose wisely," betting that Diane would choose money for her daughter's sake, would sacrifice justice to ensure Jasmine's financial security, would do what mothers always do, and put her child first even at the cost of her own vindication. Diane sat in Angela's conference room, staring at the evidence Catherine had fabricated, the fake emails and the false financial records and the paid witnesses, and Angela was explaining that they could fight this, that the evidence was obviously manufactured, that they could prove Catherine was lying. But it would take time and money and energy, months or years of additional legal battles. And meanwhile, Richard could be arrested and charged, and Diane's credibility would be questioned again, and the entire case could unravel, while they fought to prove yet another lie. Diane looked exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, exhausted from fighting, from surviving, from constantly having to prove her humanity to people who were determined to see her as less than, and Jasmine could see her mother calculating the costs and benefits, weighing justice against security, principle against pragmatism, and Jasmine knew her mother was about to give up, was about to accept whatever settlement Catherine offered, just to make it all stop. Angela was advising them to keep fighting, insisting that Catherine was bluffing, that the fabricated evidence wouldn't hold up to scrutiny, but legal battles required resources and time and faith in a system that had never protected people like them, and Diane had very little of any of those things left. So she looked at Jasmine with tears in her eyes, and started to say that maybe they should take what they could get, that survival was more important than vindication, that Jasmine's future mattered more than Diane's need for justice. But before she could finish speaking, Jasmine interrupted her mother for the first time in her life, her voice clear and strong and certain, saying, "No, Mama, you taught me to stand up for what's right. If we quit now, what lesson does that teach me?" Jasmine had been thinking about this moment for days, had been preparing, had been working with Marcus and Angela in secret because she knew Catherine would try something like this, would play one last dirty trick. And Jasmine had been gathering her own evidence, building her own case, because she understood something the adults hadn't quite grasped, that 9-year-old black girls were invisible to people like Catherine Hartwell, overlooked and underestimated and dismissed as powerless, which meant they could see and hear and document things that no one expected. She pulled out an old cell phone that Marcus had given her, a phone with a recording app, and she explained that she had recorded her encounter with Catherine at their apartment weeks ago when Catherine had come to threaten them, had recorded every word of Catherine's threats about CPS and destroying them and using her connections, and the recording was crystal clear, Catherine's voice unmistakable, admitting to filing a false report and planning to fabricate evidence. But that wasn't all. Jasmine had more. She had been at the Hartwell mansion the night she overheard Catherine and Richard fighting. And when she had looked through the window, she had also looked through Catherine's purse that was sitting on a table near the window. And she had taken photos with the phone Marcus gave her, photos of documents Catherine had been reviewing, notes about her plans to frame Richard, drafts of the fake emails she would later use, evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. Jasmine laid out her evidence on the conference table. This 9-year-old child presenting a case that would destroy Catherine's final play, and Angela looked at the recordings and the photos with growing amazement and said, "This changes everything. This proves Catherine committed multiple crimes, perjury and filing false reports and witness tampering and conspiracy. She's not threatening us anymore. We're threatening her." Angela called an emergency meeting with all parties, the Hartwell lawyers and Catherine and Richard. Everyone gathered in a conference room at a neutral location, with Angela controlling the agenda, and she presented Jasmine's evidence methodically and devastatingly, playing the recording of Catherine admitting to the false CPS report, showing the photos of Catherine's notes about framing Richard, laying out a timeline that proved Catherine had been planning this final gambit for weeks. The Hartwell family lawyers went pale, whispering frantically to each other, because this evidence didn't just destroy Catherine's fraud case against Richard, it exposed her to serious criminal liability, obstruction of justice and witness, tampering and filing false police reports, charges that could send her to prison, and suddenly, the power dynamic had completely reversed. Angela made a new demand: $20 million for all plaintiffs, public admission of Charles Hartwell's crimes, establishment of a foundation to support assault survivors funded by the Hartwell family in perpetuity, and both Catherine and Richard must resign from Hartwell Properties and all associated boards, and all victims get to tell their stories publicly, without any non-disclosure agreements. Take it, or Catherine faces criminal prosecution. Catherine was cornered, trapped by a 9-year-old's ingenuity and courage, and Jasmine watched the woman who had seemed so powerful and untouchable just days ago crumble as she realized she had no moves left, no threats that mattered, no leverage to use, and the settlement was accepted that day. All terms agreed to, papers signed by lawyers and witnessed and made binding. 6 months later, life looked completely different for Jasmine and Diane. They had moved to a safe, comfortable apartment in a better neighborhood, not wealthy but stable and secure, with working heat and no peeling paint, and a landlord who treated them with respect, and Diane had received a kidney transplant, donated by one of the other survivors in an act of profound solidarity, and she was healthy for the first time in years, working part-time at a community center and building a new life. Jasmine was back in school and thriving, still processing everything that had happened through weekly therapy sessions that the settlement paid for, still figuring out who she was and what her story meant, but she was strong and determined and surrounded by people who loved her and saw her value. The foundation was established and operating, helping other women come forward about abuse by powerful men, providing legal support and counseling and financial assistance, turning the Hartwell family's legacy of harm into something that actively fought against harm. And Angela had more cases than she could handle, women from all over the state reaching out for help, and the work of exposing systems of power and exploitation continued. Richard had divorced Catherine and moved away from Charlotte, trying to rebuild some kind of life and make some kind of amends, and he sent monthly letters to Jasmine, which she didn't read yet, but kept in a box in her closet. Maybe someday she would be ready to hear what he had to say, but that day hadn't come yet, and Catherine had become a pariah in Charlotte's society. The social circles that had once embraced her, now shunning her, her name becoming synonymous with cruelty and cover-up, her power and influence gone. On Jasmine's 10th birthday, exactly 1 year after she had first walked up to that mansion gate with a basket of oranges, a lawyer contacted Diane with shocking news that neither of them had expected. Charles Hartwell had maintained a secret will that had only recently been discovered in a safe deposit box that no one knew existed, written just months before his death, and in this will, Charles had done something extraordinary. He had confessed to everything, naming all his victims, detailing all his crimes, and leaving a portion of his personal fortune, separate from the family business and the estate, directly to any children born of his crimes. The lawyer read them the relevant passage from the will, Charles's words written in his own hand. "This money is blood money. I am a monster. I have spent my life hurting people and silencing them, and convincing myself I had the right. If you are reading this, I am dead and cannot be punished. But perhaps this can provide something I never did in life: accountability. And it was signed and dated and legally binding. Jasmine was entitled to $5 million from this secret fund, money that was hers alone, that couldn't be touched by the settlement or controlled by anyone else. But there was something else in the safe deposit box: personal letters that Charles had written to each child he knew he had fathered through assault, including one sealed envelope addressed to Jasmine Brooks. And the lawyer handed it to her and asked if she wanted to read it. Jasmine held the envelope, feeling its weight, knowing that inside was the final piece of her biological father's legacy: his words to the daughter he had created through violence, his attempt at explanation or apology or justification. And she looked at her mother sitting beside her, Diane's face anxious and supportive, and ready to help Jasmine through whatever was in that letter. And Jasmine made a decision. She looked at the lawyer and said, "I don't need his words. I know who I am. I'm the daughter of the strongest woman in the world. I'm a survivor, not a victim. I'm Jasmine Brooks, and I'm not defined by how I was created. I'm defined by who I choose to be." And she walked to the fireplace in Angela's office, where they had been meeting, and she lit the envelope on fire, watched it burn, watched her father's words turn to ash without ever reading them. The message was clear and powerful. The Hartwell's power over them was finally, truly, completely ended. Not because of money or settlements or legal victories, though those mattered, but because Jasmine and Diane had chosen to define their own story, had chosen to survive and fight and win on their own terms, had chosen to transform trauma into strength and silence, into testimony and shame into pride. And they were free in a way that went beyond legal or financial freedom, free to be themselves without apology or explanation or the weight of other people's sins. They had survived, they had fought, they had won, and most importantly, they had done it together. Mother and daughter. Black women refusing to be erased or silenced or diminished, claiming their space in the world, and their right to justice, and their power to change the systems that had tried to destroy them. What would you have done in Jasmine's position? Would you have read the letter, or burned it like she did? And how do we teach our children to find strength in the face of injustice? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please hit that like button, and subscribe to hear more stories about courage and justice and the power of speaking truth. Share this with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that fighting back is worth it, and that we are never defined by the worst things that happen to us, but by how we choose to rise from them. Thank you for listening to Jasmine and Diane's story. May we all find the courage to stand up for what's right, and the wisdom to know that justice delayed is not justice denied if we refuse to give up the fight.